Good morning and welcome to Jakarta. Finally, we have a workshop in Share with almost only students. They are committed to, of course, their own career path, but also to building their country and building an ASEAN community.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to the second day of the EU Support to Higher Education in the ASEAN Region's Policy Dialogue 12. My name is Darren McDermott and I'm the team leader of the SHARE program. SHARE is the largest higher education cooperation program underway in ASEAN, and this is fitting considering the recently formalized strategic partnership between the EU and ASEAN within the context of a now 44-year-old dialogue partnership. SHARE's overarching objective is to strengthen regional cooperation and enhance the quality, competitiveness, and internationalization of ASEAN higher education, contributing to the development of an ASEAN higher education space. SHARE's approach to supporting regional higher education is inclusive. The program engages with ASEAN and relevant non-ASEAN entities to build on existing initiatives and to serve as a platform for engagement with the wider higher education community in the region. As a program, we champion mobility, people-to-people connectivity, and the augmentation of links between the EU and ASEAN communities. It therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce a truly global expert on connectivity, mobility, and the forces that will shape our collective futures. Based in Singapore, Dr. Parag Khanna founded FutureMap, a database strategic advisory firm, following a successful career as a research fellow. Parag's 2019 best-selling book, The Future is Asian, cemented his reputation as one of the world's leading geopolitical thinkers. It builds on the success of his trilogy on the evolving world order, the second world, how to run the world, and connectography. Parag's forthcoming and seventh book is Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. Move provides an illuminating and authoritative vision of the next phase of human civilization, one that is both mobile and sustainable. Parag holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's and master's degrees from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has traveled to nearly 150 countries and is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Parag has very kindly agreed to take questions following his presentation, so please put your questions in the chat box for us to put to him. It's a great pleasure to have you join the SHARE program, Policy Dialogue, Parag, and the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Darren, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be able to join all of you today from around the world, and especially those of us here in ASEAN. As you'll see in the subsequent time that we have together, I'm very, very passionate about your mission, and I want to share some thoughts with you to kick off your sessions for today. So let me jump right in, and the operative word in what Darren said at the beginning for me was connectivity, of course, and it's something that I believe in very strongly at times like this, where people speak about, for example, limitations around physical mobility and the ability of people to cross borders. Connectivity has been a salvation. It's been more important than ever. So let's talk about the role of connectivity in the context of mobility, education mobility, and certainly the relations among peoples and the circulation among peoples, especially young people and students, within the geography that you see here on this map, which is, of course, the greater Eurasia, this mega continent that encompasses a significant majority of the human population. So I'm going to jump right in and point to some very important structural trends underway in the world that bear upon your mission and upon what sort of characteristics will define the global order and how it will really help to be a platform in a way for everything that you're doing. Now, what you see here is that despite the fact that the last 5 years of our media environment, of our geopolitics, have been dominated by the notion of the US-China axis being the definitive relationship of the 21st century. Now, that may be true in a military sense, but it's certainly not true in an economic sense, because the two most trade-dependent regions of the world are very clearly, and by a wide margin, as you see here, Europe and Asia. And not only that, not only are they the most trade-dependent regions of the world, but notice that their trade with each other, $1.6 trillion per year, is the largest number, is the largest value of trade between any two regions of the world. And furthermore, if you had to predict which of these three relationships, transatlantic, Trans-Pacific, or Eurasian, would grow the fastest in the years ahead, you would place your bet on the Eurasian relationship. Because here, between Europe and Asia, you not only see a growth in the volume of trade in goods and services, you see the infrastructure investment through projects like the Belt and Road and other connectivity kinds of projects. You also see free trade liberalization efforts. Europe has signed an FTA with Japan, with Korea, with Vietnam. It would like to have one with ASEAN as a whole. It's been opening a dialogue with India around the same. So whereas North America remains relatively protectionist, Europe and Asia are trying to open more to each other. Europe is also pushing very hard on reciprocity in its relations with China too. So the momentum in this equation is very much on the Eurasian level. And even though there are tensions in Europe politically over how one deals with China, there is at the same time an embrace, a very strong embrace of Asia as a whole. And I think that's obviously going to favor Southeast Asia in particular. Let's also look at how the regions are integrating or interacting institutionally. And here there's also been a lot of progress. And here China, of course, plays a very, very central role. If you look at this Venn diagram of the Asian-centric institutions, after decades of borrowing from or integrating or aligning or adapting to the Western-led international order, Asians have been borrowing from that playbook and building their own platforms, their own institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And if you can see the fine print literally here inside that circle in the middle, the AIB's membership extends to almost every country in Europe and most countries in Asia and many countries in Africa, even Latin America. So from the inside out, Asia has been developing these institutions that are incentivizing other parts of the world, especially Europe and the Middle East, to get more connected to Asia. Now, this means not only just financing of heavy infrastructure projects, but even soft infrastructure, healthcare, even training of professionals, vocational kinds of things. So infrastructure is now defined very broadly in the same way that it is in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this will certainly have knock-on effects in terms of the development of common standards, for example. Standards in how products are made, how services are delivered, in infrastructure itself. And that all requires common platforms of training, for example. So I think that there is a direct linkage between what's happening here institutionally as Europeans and Asians find themselves in more technical kinds of bodies and frameworks such as this, that have an impact on how the next generation seeks to be educated and where they seek to be educated. And now, of course, there is what's happening within ASEAN itself, which is an incremental, yes, but a very palpable, tangible set of measures that have been undertaken, that have accumulated in the last couple of decades and are accelerating now. Now, let me say as a backdrop, because we are facing the pandemic. The pandemic is one of several significant crises that have hit the region economically and socially since the 1990s. We had the Asian financial crisis of 1998, the SARS epidemic of 2003, the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9, and now, of course, the pandemic. And each time we see a pattern develop or emerge. And that pattern, fortunately, is that governments learn to respond more quickly. They realize that when supply chains are cut off, when there's a global demand shock, they have to look to their neighbors more. And so it's not a surprise that of the areas that are moving forward in regional integration, there is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the largest trade liberalization framework in the world, was signed at the height of the pandemic, right, late last year. You have strong support from governments in ASEAN to continue to invest in transnational and cross-border infrastructure projects. You've also seen, of course, the superb performance in the New York Stock Exchange of companies like C Group and the IPOs of companies like Grab, Gojek, which is now Go2, and so forth. All of this is happening in the middle of a pandemic. It's rather remarkable because it's a sign that countries have realized that in times of crisis, you don't put up walls and borders. You immediately reach out to your neighbors. You try and extend cross-border. You try to keep the digital connectivity alive. You build connections between central banks so that you can have swap lines for currencies. All of these things are happening. So I hope that despite the tragedy that we continue to face with the pandemic around the region and globally, that as with previous crises, the learning is going to accelerate. The lessons will be integrated, and we'll move towards a new plateau, a new level of depth and breadth and speed in developing relations here within the region. And the same thing can be said across Asia and between Europe and Asia as well. Now, let's focus on the demographic picture. Why is ASEAN in particular and Asia in general so important? Well, I put it there in capital letters just in case there's any doubt. If I had to make one statement, one sentence about the future of the human species, I would probably choose, well, you could choose climate migration, but that's not our topic today. I would choose Asian youth. And the evidence is right here on this slide. Now, even in China, right there, the yellow graphic that you see in the middle in that table, it actually will have a declining youth population over time in the years ahead. We know that, in fact, the Chinese population as a whole is now peaking. So among the only regions of the world where the population of young people will actually continue to grow is actually Southeast Asia. And it's also to some degree in the Arab world as well, to a strong degree, actually. Whereas other regions have a declining or flat youth population. If you look at the chart on the bottom, it's even more stark. The number of working age millennials is about 68 million people in Europe, 63 million in the Eurozone. If you take all youth total, it's only double that number. Whereas if you look to the far right in yellow, there are 822 million just working age millennials in Europe. The total number of Asian youth is round about 2 billion people. So literally you might say that the most coherent, though it isn't a single country or nation or religion, but geographically collective group of people beyond one state, where you can almost sense also a common sets of values and priorities, that might literally be Asian youth. Now, there's something else that's going on. By mentioning the decline in population in China, in Japan, and Western economies, I'm also alluding to something bigger, which is that, of course, the world population itself as a whole is reaching a plateau. And therefore, the fact that Asia has the largest share of young people in the world is an advantage over just about any other part of the world. And what's more, young people, of course, embrace digitization and new economic models. So when we look at Asia, we should see economies that are, even if their per capita income is low, they are already services economies. In other words, like young people in Western societies, young people in ASEAN are using digital apps to find their jobs. They're living in cities, they're working in healthcare or hospitality or retail or construction or technology, telecoms, finance, you name it. These are all services sectors. And so what you see here on this, in this graphic is that the majority of the economies of countries in Asia are indeed services-based economies. And the faster that happens, the faster the services economy matures, the more wages rise. And you see young people then investing in education, in skills training, and that can be done either in formal institutions or in online platforms, because of course the rate of digital connectivity is rising so quickly as well. So when we look at ASEAN, we should be educating for services sector skills in the same way that we're doing in the rest of the world too. And all of that is going to be part of this positive cycle, this self-reinforcing cycle of growth, not just economic growth, but of economic maturity as well, and training people for future-ready jobs, not for jobs that are going to be automated away by robots. And that's what is often meant by this term that you see towards the bottom of the slide, premature deindustrialization, right? This means that labor automation is happening everywhere. And even though ASEAN societies are quite fortunate to be in a position where companies want to shift industrial supply chains out of China or out of high-wage countries into ASEAN, the volume of those jobs will not be as high as it was in the past. And therefore, in order to overcome the middle income trap of doing only low to medium wage work, one has to double down on training young people for the services economy. Now, of course, those become portable skills, right? If you can learn how to code, that means that you can potentially have a global job, not just a local job. You can engage in tradable services, not just local, non-tradable services, which makes you a participant in the global war for talent. Now, this phrase, war for talent, has a relatively long history, the last several decades, but it's had a real evolution in terms of its meanings. In the 2000s, when we used the phrase war for talent, we basically were just talking about the upper echelons of management in the financial sector, more or less. And it was really about who is hiring the top bankers between London and New York. That's really the original origin of that phrase. But things changed with the financial crisis in the late 2000s and with the rise of tech, as well as the rise of emerging markets. So in the past decade, what we saw is a broadening of this war for talent. Now, this meant by emerging markets, we focused still largely on China and not yet on the rest of Asia. And when we were talking about industries, tech and finance competing with each other was really the main dynamic. So I mentioned here Silicon Valley poaching Wall Street finance and Wall Street poaching Silicon Valley tech. That is certainly still happening, right? But now, not only because it's a new decade with a much broader global economy and many more markets that are competing, we also have the profound extensity of digitization. And now with the pandemic, the acceleration of remote work, all of these things coming into play. And we are therefore entering quite a new phase in this war for talent. And it isn't just the people who are already graduates. It's young people already who are capable of remote work at any age. All they need is to be connected. And of course, education models are changing to recognize and to certify and to take advantage of people who are skilled in certain areas, irrespective of their educational credentials. So what we see now is a multi-level game that is more complex than we've ever seen in previous phases. The competition is between countries, it's between companies, it's even within companies as young people are deciding where they want to live and are playing companies off each other to get the best deal. And then it also has to do with the youth values, not just of connectivity, but mobility and sustainability, and what kinds of environments best reflect their values. So that's a segue to talking about students. The war for talent for young workers is also, in many ways, the precursor to it demographically is a war for students. Now, here too, you have very significant disruptions. You have disruptions within countries, given remote work and vocational programs and remote learning and digital programs and platforms. And now also internationally, because there has been a significant upgrading of educational systems to compete in this market. So clearly the US is still in the lead when it comes to the net number, at least as of 2019, foreign students attracted into the market. But there's a lot of changes underway that I've tried to enumerate here. First of all, actually, when you look at the sort of additional quotient of talent that is attracted to the US as a share of the globally mobile student body, it's actually been declining for 20 years, since the 9/11 terrorist attacks that were 20 years ago. It has a lot to do with the politics of visas and immigration into the United States, which is something that still obviously has not been resolved and has only been made more complex by US-China tension and by political polarization and by the pandemic. But also, of course, the distance, because as Asia's emerging markets more broadly and ASEAN have risen, and even American campuses have come and set up around the region, there is potentially more incentive to stay in the region than to travel that far. There's also been, as I mentioned, competition from other English-speaking countries. Canada, I mentioned here, but also, of course, the UK. Despite Brexit, the UK enjoyed a very significant increase in applications and in admission last year because it was seen as an alternative to the US. Canada, for sure, just actually ranked #1 in some of the expat surveys in terms of a destination for talent because of the number of full-time jobs being created there. But they have also changed their educational model to focus on blended degrees, so more vocational and linked to jobs. And then there's Europe, which I think is doing very interesting things because over the years, we've seen a couple of key shifts. One is English language education within the European Union on the continent. And that, of course, attracts talented young people from around the world. Another is, of course, the cost comparison versus Canada and most certainly versus the US. Then, of course, there's the economic factor, I should add. As Asians and Europeans are seeing that mutual interest in trading more with each other, as I was showing earlier, that, of course, increases the incentive of Asians to want to study in Europe and learn in Europe and so forth. And, of course, the immigration policy. Now here, immigration to Europe is, of course, quite difficult. But country by country, and partially at the EU level, there are efforts around things like blue cards. Now, I have noticed this firsthand as I've traveled in and out of Germany a fair bit in recent years. And I've noticed the number of Asian blue card holders in the technology sector. Of course, technology is the area with among the most significant labor shortages across the Western world, across the OECD world. The United States, Canada, and Europe all have shortages of technology workers. And so I've seen more and more South Asians in Europe filling those labor shortages. So it's a reflection of the complementarity between Europe and Asia in terms of skill sets, and of course, the growing desirability of Europe for these reasons. Keep in mind also that educational systems in Asia itself are, of course, improving. The number of Asian universities that are climbing up the rankings has increased, for example. And then we can't ignore just the overall allure of Asia's economic growth, the quality of life in Asian countries, and then the pandemic issues around how far to travel, when to return to travel, and these kinds of things. So I would say, on balance, despite the incumbent status that the US has in this market, it really is up for grabs. The young Asian students are up for grabs, and it really is an exciting and a very important opportunity for Europe to capture. Now, let me say a few more things about this skills shortage in the West, in Europe in particular, and how Asian geographies can make a strong contribution to bridging those gaps and to really encourage and promote the continued dynamism of Western economies. Now, what's so interesting here is that whereas when it comes to the volume of foreign students in Western countries overall, especially Asian students, Chinese have dominated. But when you look at the demographics, as I was showing you earlier, of the youth populations and the median age of Asian countries, India is the future in so many ways. It's the median age is a dozen years younger than that of China. and even as the population is the same. Now, because most of India's students and graduates who go abroad are English speaking and remain abroad, you already today, even before this demographic inflection, you already have a substantially larger number of Indian migrants, professional migrants in OECD countries as Chinese. That gap will grow considerably in the years ahead. Now, we can't ignore some of the reasons why, because they're not all positive. It has to do with the way in which India has handled COVID, the populism in India's politics, the economic distress, and so forth. So there will continue to be an outflow of Indians. On the other hand, let's bear in mind that they're English speaking, whereas it's often more difficult for Chinese. The educational focal points in institutions like IIT and IIM are, of course, technical. And the geopolitics of Western relations with China are also adding to that picture. So all of these factors together point to an ever larger Indian diasporic population and a potentially large student body or sort of gain of Indian students. And if we take South Asia as a whole, that gap becomes even larger because, of course, the median age in Bangladesh and in Pakistan is actually younger than that of China. And ASEAN as a region has only half the population of India, but let's remember that the growth rate is now higher, the COVID recovery is better, and this integration effect is also taking place. So ASEAN is becoming a very significant catchment area for students as well. Why is it so important for Europe to take advantage of the Asian demographic dividend? Well, I think as all of you know, the demographics of aging in Europe is a critical variable in this, right? Of all regions of the world, Europe has the highest median age. Its net population is actually declining despite immigration. So high is the mortality rate. The working age population is shrinking. And all of the fertility programs, to put it bluntly, have not worked. And of course, fiscally, 50% of the outstanding global pension obligations are in Europe. Now, that, of course, has to do with the fact that they're very generous compared to other regions. In order to maintain that standard, it's going to require a young, industrious, entrepreneurial workforce in the services sector that plants roots, that learns the businesses, that settles, that pays taxes, and that develops those bonds in a way to Europe. So, of course, Europe's future population is going to be more of what I call Asian Europeans. Now, that's a term that did not exist until roughly today. I coined this term, Asian European. It's a bit ironic. I mean, I grew up as an Asian American. I emigrated to the United States when I was about 7 years old. And so I was called an Asian American. And there were very few Asian Europeans at the time. I actually went to high school in Germany, and there was not another ethnic Indian for many, many, many kilometers radius of where I was. But as I mentioned before, when I go to Europe today, and to Germany in particular, and I see the tech companies and their workforce, I am seeing more and more South Asians. And that begs this broader question around the new patterns of migration in the post-pandemic world. Because we have, up until 2019, settled into fairly stable patterns of mostly intra-regional migration. The largest stock actually of cross-border migrants over the last 20 years is the resorting of people within the former Soviet Union. You can see there are almost 23 million people. And behind that, you have the flows within the Western Hemisphere, then people within Africa, of course, the South Asian population into the Gulf countries. Within ASEAN, people often forget there's 10 million foreign sort of cross-border residents. A lot of it is Indonesians and Malaysians moving back and forth. And of course, people within Western Europe and so on. How will this change in the years ahead in light of the various phenomenon that I've been talking about? Because when you think about the main driver of migration in the 20th century, it was indeed filling labor shortages. Turkish populations in Western Europe, for example, Latin American populations into North America, and of course, South Asians as well, and East Asians into the United States. Could it be that in the years ahead, there will be even more Asian Europeans than there are Asian Americans? And that is a bet that I am making. That is a sort of forecast that I am making. Now, there are 20-something million Asian Americans today. And outside of Britain, since that's no longer in the EU, there's only about 4 million or so Asian Europeans. But based upon the staggering mismatch between old and young, the economic complementarities, the growing trade relationships, you could potentially forecast, and of course politics plays an important role here, but you could forecast that indeed Europe can very easily absorb another 20 or so million Asians. And I do believe there will be a whole new class, a whole new category of Asian Europeans deepening in the years ahead. At the same time, of course, there is that question about geography and the desirability of geographies. Where do people want to go? Young Asians also feel, like young professionals, young students, young talent everywhere, that they want to potentially be able to work remotely. So it's not just a competition among universities and academic institutions. It's a competition among geographies to attract cloud people. And again, even in all of the levels of skill, low, medium, technical, highly skilled, there are shortages, there are opportunities globally, and Asians are going to fill those gaps. And where Asians may choose to live may be shaped by where they study and what educational certifications they acquire. So to be a country that is winning the global war for talent, you do want to be building those relationships with the students of today, the students of tomorrow, first and foremost, because they are going to be the remote workers who hold the leverage in the future as countries are trying very hard to attract them. And I love this quote that you see here from Simon Cooper of the Financial Times. He says, if you can do your job from anywhere, someone anywhere can do your job. Well, that's already happening. What we've seen is that Western companies have realized that if there is going to be permanently remote work, they can expand their presence in Asia. They can tap Asian talent at competitive wages. They can simply get those young software programmers and web app developers and so forth connected and have them working at the same jobs as people that were paid much more in Western economies. So this is actually a great time to be a young Asian pursuing a technical degree, technical education, in an Asian institution or one that's partnered with a European or Western institution, and developing those skills and putting oneself out there remotely to be a remote worker, or ideally then using that, and this is what does often happen historically, as a step migration. Because once you've gained a degree from somewhere, you have one additional credential that you can use in your applications for immigration and so forth. So I think Asians are going to be circulating more and more based on the skills that they're building, the skills that you are helping them to acquire. So this reality of a globally uprooted population, of Asians on the move everywhere, of hopefully societies taking advantage of the young and mobile populations of the future, the 4 billion people who are young that can meet the labor shortages and the talent shortages in their economies, is a critical aspect of achieving a new demographic equilibrium, which is something that we all need to contribute to as a civilizational mission as our world population begins to plateau. And those are the conditions and those are the issues that I explore in my forthcoming book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, that's coming out this October. I want to emphasize a couple of things. One is youth are the center, right? What's really fascinating and maybe terrifying about global demographics today is that as we reach, one of the reasons we're reaching this plateau in the world population that may not reach 9 billion people is because young people are not having children at the rate that they have in the 20th century. So fertility has dropped below replacement rate in most societies. So what that means, and this will sound like a science fiction plot, is that the present is the future. Today's youth are not only the largest generation in the history of the human species, but they will continue to be the largest generation because they're not having children come after them. So for any institution or any country to win the global war for talent, it must be doing whatever it can to attract youth today. The final point I want to make is that despite the xenophobia, the populism, the borders, and the onerous new requirements around mobility that relate to vaccine certifications and so forth, fundamentally, we are a migratory species. The map that you see here in the middle shows, the pink line shows the 100,000-year history of human migrations. And I believe, as I showed you before, there will be a new pattern of migration in the future. And these pink lines, that is the trail being followed by the gentleman on the right side of the photo here, Paul Salopek. He is walking around the world. And this is an amazing educational project that has been funded by National Geographic in the United States. It's a 15-year project to literally walk from the Rift Valley of Africa all the way to Tierra del Fuego in South America. And I'm very taken by this initiative. And everywhere he goes, he's running significant, educational modules and workshops. There are in journalism schools around the world courses devoted to following what he's doing and teaching his methods of slow journalism. But most of all, it's about us. It's an anthropological project to teach people about each other at a civilizational level. So I'm donating profits from this book directly to that charity, because I think it's so important, and it's something that we can learn about ourselves, about our future, that hopefully will also shape our decisions in how we as institutions compete and collaborate in this global war for talent in the future. So thank you very much. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Parag. That's really inspirational. The story of Mr. Salopek and his moving around the world. I mean, here's to keep moving. It's been a very rough couple of years for globalization and the increase of populism, and I think international education has suffered as a result. But the direction we're moving now seems to be a lot better. Thank you again for joining the Share Policy Dialogue. We did have some questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to move into the panel discussion. We're really looking forward to getting a copy of Move the Book in October and following the launch events that will be happening in Singapore and around the world. So once again, thank you, Parag.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Okay, so now we'll move into the panel discussion component of the day 2 of the Share Policy Dialogue. And today's session will look at the emerging developments and innovations facilitating the digital transformation of ASEAN higher education. By way of context for this session, it's useful to reflect on some of the key objectives of the recently adopted ASEAN Work Plan on Education 2021 to 2025, and specifically Activity 3.2.3 to design and institutionalize an ASEAN-wide digital credit transfer system. And this is to support ASEAN student mobility. And Activity 3.2.7 to promote inter- and intra-regional student exchange programs through face-to-face and/or virtual or online. So the panelists in this session will reflect on the European context of digital credentials, a study currently being undertaken by the SHARE program, which is contributing to the development of these work plan activities. And we'll also learn about an excellent example of a recent digital credentials project between a Singaporean company and a Dutch university. So I'm really pleased to be joined by an expert panel from Asia and Europe today. And first of all, Mr. Anthony Camilleri, who's the senior partner of the Knowledge Information Center in Malta and consultant to the SHARE program. Hi, Anthony.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And next up, we have Dr. Keiko Ikeda, who's the Vice Director of the Institute of Innovative Global Education at Kansai University, Japan, and also a consultant to the SHARE program. Hi, Keiko.
Hi, Darren. Hi, everybody.
Great. And joining Keiko is Dr. Abdul Latif Ahmad, Director of the International Relations Center at the University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, or UKM Global, and consultant to the SHARE program also. Hi, Latif.
Hi, Darren. Hello, everyone.
Great. And last but not least, Mr. Zhengwei Kwa, CEO and co-founder of Accreditation, and a friend of the SHARE program. Hi, Jengwei.
Thanks, Darren. Hi, everyone.
Right. So first to Anthony. Anthony's expertise is in the area of quality assurance processes, knowledge transfer research. Within quality assurance, he's given training on techniques for peer review to quality assurance agencies around Europe and contributed to the guidelines on quality assurance of e-learning. Anthony has been heavily involved in designing and implementing the European digital credentials infrastructure as part of the Europass project in conjunction with the European Commission, and is currently leading a SHARE program project on digital transformation of the ASEAN European credit transfer system. But today, Anthony's focus is very much on his work with Europass and maybe what we can learn from it on the SHARE program and also in ASEAN. So the floor is yours, Anthony. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So as you mentioned, well, Darren, the idea today is to share a little bit of the work we've been doing on digital credentials in Europe, in particular as regards the Europass project. And the reason I think this would be interesting for an Asian audience is because the Europass project is probably the first project globally that tries to implement a standardized digital credential system at scale. Our simple objective here is to have a single digital credentialing standard for a market of 400 million people. To put a little bit of context in, digital credentials have risen to the fore of EU policy making in the last 3 years or so, and they're considered an essential part of a number of different policy initiatives across the Union. First of all, the communication on achieving the European education area by 2025 that really talks about, let's say, bringing European education systems together, highlights the role of digital credentials in forming the education area. The Europass decision is an implementing decision, which basically where the member states request the European Commission to set up a digital credentialing system. The European data strategy talks about the creation of a number of European data spaces in areas ranging from health to Industry 4.0 to aerospace to ensure Europe's competitiveness in the coming decades. And as part of those data spaces, it also proposes the creation of a skills and qualifications database that is based on digital credentials. And finally, the European Skills Agenda highlights the importance of user-held credentials in helping them plan their careers and realize their employment goals moving forward. So putting all of that into account, that tells you where we're doing digital credentials, but it's also important to ask, why did the European Commission feel the need to launch a digital credential initiative at all? And put at a high level, when you looked at the market 3 years ago, what we were seeing is that despite an increasing move to digitization, we were not sure that this move to digitization was necessarily bringing the benefits that we would hope to users. There were a multiplicity of different providers moving into the area. A lot of times the standards would not be compatible with each other. They would not talk to each other. They would not necessarily have the same data protection values that would be expected from a European system. And ironically, by moving from paper to digital, we were finding that we were actually making the system less interoperable. Paper may be slow, but it is accepted everywhere. The same wasn't being said for digital credentials. So in moving into the space, the first area we really wanted to address was market fragmentation and ensure that any market fragmentation that had already started would be halted and that we could really talk about a European digital credential space. The second part, when we talk about this space, is really saying that we want to be able to analyze skills data at scale across Europe to inform trend forecasting, to inform guidance systems, to understand what the skills of the future are and the demand for them. And we need to do all of this in a way that gives us high quality data, but also that preserves privacy for users. The third thing that we wanted to do is remove barriers for true recognition. So being able to transfer credits from one country to another or transfer entire diplomas from one country to another can be unnecessarily bureaucratic, especially when trying to determine the authenticity and equivalence of credentials. And that's something that we wanted to work on being able to solve. Furthermore, there are a number of requirements that we considered to, let's say, be more important in Europe than your typical American startup would necessarily consider. First of all, we didn't want to build a system in English and then translate it. We wanted it to be multilingual by default from the beginning. Secondly, user ownership of credentials. So we don't want the institution that issues the credentials to be in control of a credential. We want the user who earned the credential to be in control of it. And thirdly, there is an entire alphabet soup of European quality assurance and recognition instruments, the qualifications framework, the credit transfer scheme, the Europass diploma supplement, the credit supplement, and I could go on. And we wanted, of course, to also ensure native support for this family of recognition tools that has been developed through the Bologna process over the last years. So to do all of this, we first and foremost developed a standard for digital credentials. We had to look at the standards that were available globally to see if they met our needs, but none of the standards for describing learning met our needs of being able to cover all levels of education with a user-held credential. So when we talk about a Europass digital credential, it's first and foremost a container for information. And the type of information that we can hold in a credential includes information about the organization issuing the credential, information about the person receiving the credential, and very, very critically, a digital signature that secures the authenticity of the credential. Within a credential, we can describe any type of existing certificate that is issued by any kind of educational organization to a student. And we do that by being able to describe what actually goes into the certificate. So we are able to put information of activities in a certificate, doing 100 hours of coursework, 100 hours of apprenticeship, spending 1 hour attending this webinar. These are activities you do, they're things you've done. We also can record information about achievements, and achievements are basically things you've earned as a result of an activity. So we describe those in terms of learning outcomes. We prove that you have received the learning outcome by including information about assessments. So we are able to record, for example, that a German student received a qualification as a painter, that it includes a set of learning outcomes related to the profession of painting, and furthermore that we proved this via a set of examinations that resulted in grade B. If learning has a licensing component, which very often it does, you might need a license to work in a certain profession, you might need to join a medical chamber or a lawyer's bar, you might need a qualification of you might need one qualification to gain access to a higher level qualification. So very, very often, you see that a credential gives you access to some other set of rights. And we call these entitlements, and we're also able to code these within the credentials. The last type of information we include in here is attestations. And attestations are essentially a special type of credential which speaks about other credentials. And attestations can be used, for example, to issue enigmatic recognition certificates. To be able to deploy such an ambitious system across Europe, we didn't just need to launch a credentialing service. We needed to launch an entire infrastructure that would allow member states to participate across this. So when we talk about Europass digital credentials, we're actually talking about, first of all, a set of standards, which is the Europass learning model I just described, as well as a set of interoperability standards that describe how vendors and institutions can transmit credentials between them. Secondly, it involves a set of services which are provided by the European Commission. So as the European Commission, we provide an issuer service that allows institutions to issue credentials to students for free. We provide a wallet service that allows students to store credentials for free as part of their overall portfolio. And we have over 2 million users of this wallet service at the moment, with 10,000 being added per day. We have a viewer service that allows you to view and verify the credentials, an accreditation database that is a trusted issuer list of accredited institutions in Europe, as well as some complementary services, including a search for courses and qualifications in Europe and a set of open data services that back all this up. Now, the Commission doesn't want to necessarily be the only issuer, storer, and viewer of credentials in Europe. The point of this policy work is to actually stimulate the creation of a interoperable credential market in Europe. So everything we use to build the services, we open source. We open source it in a number of different ways, and we work with vendors across the continent to actually integrate this open source software into their existing systems. So we want you to be able to issue Europass credentials from your existing learning management system. We want any e-portfolio provider to be able to offer their own wallet. We want HR system providers to integrate wallets into their systems. And in our own projections, we hope that we'll only be a minor player in the market once this gets onboarded. So to do that, as mentioned, we offer everything we do is open source code. We also offer help desks. We offer support to implementers to be able to do this. And if any of you are interested in more information about this, I'm happy to provide it in a bilateral after this webinar. Last slide to mention here is this is what a digital credential looks like. And the important, and it's made up of 3 parts. On the left, you can see the different information areas that you can click on and see metadata about the credential. In the middle, you see a customizable visual representation of the credential. And on the right-hand side, you see the real magic of the credential, which is the authenticity of the verification check. So we run 6 different verification checks on each credential, and this is what provides the assurance that these credentials can be trusted. We run a check of the format of the credential to make sure that the credential has the metadata that is expected within the national jurisdiction it's been issued. So we make sure, for example, that this is a valid VET credential from Germany. The seal makes sure, first of all, that the institution that says they issued it really did issue it. And secondly, it makes sure that the student or other party has not tampered with the credential since it was issued. The check of the owner makes sure that it is being presented by the person the credential was actually issued to. Revocation checks that the institution hasn't chosen to withdraw the credential after issuing it. Accreditation checks if the institution was authorized to issue that type of credential. This is only used for, let's say, high-value credentials, such as university degrees or school leaving certificates and so on. But if the institution requires a accreditation to be issued to issue a type of credential, we will check that it has it. And finally, we check that the credential hasn't expired via its validity. You put all of these 6 checks together, and what you Take is a checking process which an employer would need to spend several hours over a period of weeks on to verify, and we reduce this down to a few seconds. And that is, let's say, the real efficiency gain that is gained. If I want to apply for a job in a different country, I don't need to go to a notary, have my diploma apostilled, have it officially translated, and then send it by post to that, which can take weeks. I can just send a link to this diploma, and that will be enough. So last thing to mention, these are the member states that we are currently piloting with in Europe. 18 member states in all. Digital credentials is currently in public beta and will be launched in full production, what we call version 1.0, late this October. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions later in the session.
Many thanks for that, Anthony. And it's clear there's a huge amount of work being done in this space. Now I'd like to bring in Dr. Keiko Ikeda and Dr. Abdul Latif Ahmed, who are working together on a share-funded project on another important dimension of the digital transformation of ASEAN higher education, and that's specifically virtual exchange and collaborative online international learning. Dr. Keiko Ikeda is a professor in the Division of International Affairs and KU COIL coordinator at Kansai University. And she's recently taken the role as the principal project manager for the Inter-University Exchange Project, funded by the Ministry of Education in Japan from 2018 to 2022. And this program is called the COIL Plus Program to Develop a Global Career Mindset. Dr. Abdul Latif Ahmed is an associate professor at University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. He's director of the International Relations Center and a senior lecturer in the Center for Research in Media and Communication. And his research interests include intercultural communication and internationalization. You're very welcome, Keiko and Latif, and over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. So, and I hope you can see the screen as well. So I'll be starting off just giving an overview, introduction, and a flow pass it to the Latif later. So we are working on this project. It's entitled the Mapping and the Identification Study of Existing Virtual Exchange Scheme in ASEAN. And I'd like to give you a bit of an overview in what we're doing in that research. So the objectives of this study is to map the implementation of a virtual exchange schemes by university in ASEAN region. For example, the methods and the platform used for the practice and their experiences as either a home or host university, etc. And despite the importance of the virtual exchange programs, there's very little information available regarding the implementation of a virtual exchange programs in ASEAN higher educational institutions at the moment. While different parts of the world have started a virtual exchange practice ahead of ASEAN, it's also been true that the ASEAN countries have been a partner of their virtual exchange or COIL practice along the way. And that with the COVID impact prolonging thus far, COIL and also virtual exchange have become to play a major role in the international education and beyond in the higher education institutions in the region now. So it is important to conduct a mapping and identification study of the existing virtual exchange schemes implemented by its partner universities before developing a virtual exchange component for the shared scholarship. These are the expected outcomes from the research project. One, identification of obstacles in implementing virtual exchange schemes. Technical specifications of the existing virtual exchange schemes, example, duration, platform, those are things I just mentioned earlier. And types of support provided by the university or institutions for their respective students participating in the virtual exchange schemes. A description of academic and the non-academic activities implemented in the virtual exchange scheme. And best practices and recommendations we would like to find out for implementing a region-wide virtual exchange scheme under the shared scholarship. Over to you, Latif.
Keiko, and under my section today, we'll be looking at understanding the virtual exchange from the perspectives of international higher education institutions. And what we are aiming to do with this mapping research is to do a survey and then also an interview with all the respective higher education institutions within the ASEAN regions. Firstly, with regards to the survey, well, actually, there's two surveys that we're planning to do. Firstly is the survey related to students, which Keiko will explain further in her section of the presentation. But what I'll like to explain here is with regards to the distributions of survey across University of ASEAN region, yeah? And we're hoping to get the International Relations Center or the departments handling the exchange programs to be respondents for these surveys. The aim of this survey is actually to map out issues surrounding virtual exchange, understanding it, what are the practice, the execution, and the implementation of how each universities place virtual exchange to their respective universities. With regards to the interviews, we're hoping to approximately interview around 10 universities across the ASEAN region, and we hope to explore further and understand the practice, exploring issues and challenges faced by institutions in these virtual exchanges. So there'll be a mix of a quantitative and a qualitative research in furthering the study. What's the rationale for this further research? And what we could see now is that based on studies done by the International Association Universities on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education around the world, and this survey was done in 2020, how has COVID-19 affected your partnership? A high percentage of the universities have actually responded that they were severely affected by the COVID-19. And with that, it has weakened them, and they had to concentrate on resources on local issues. With regards to whether COVID-19 has stimulated alternative to physical student mobility, well, over 60% has mentioned that they have increased virtual mobility with collaboration online learning. Now, one of the reasons we're doing this research in this aspect is to actually define the meaning of virtual mobility, virtual exchange as well. Different countries, different regions, different universities seems to have a different interpretation of what virtual exchange is. So many research that has been conducted earlier has been focused more on virtual mobility, though there were a few on virtual exchange. So we hope through our literature study and also through the survey and also interview, we'd be able to get a lot more information. And with regards to what is the impact of COVID-19 on international student mobility, over 47% said that students are unable to travel in that matter. So this has actually affected them entirely. On the next slide, it actually looks at the extent of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, and many has mentioned that student mobility are the highest implications of things that were affected, and also internationalization has also been considered as the most severely affected by the COVID-19. So in that matter, there is a need for us to explore virtual exchanges, to understand virtual exchanges, and to see how we can expand that further. These are some of the issues with regards to exchange and virtual exchange, and also the risks and potential. At the moment, again, as I've mentioned earlier, definitions, conceptualization, and a proper framework on what constitute virtual exchange need to be defined. In Malaysia, as we speak right now, they're having a workshop on defining mobility and also defining what virtual exchange is going on right now, headed by the ministry. There's still a lot of travel and border restrictions, indicating that virtual exchange is the only way to go. We also have to see that we're dealing with the digital natives right now, and the digital natives of Gen Z are fully aware of how to use technology, and for them, virtual exchange should be something that happens smoothly. However, the current Zoom fatigue or online fatigue of spending too much time on their online classes is affecting them dearly. So are they willing to be involved with virtual exchange? That is still a question to look at. Some of the attraction and the risks is the attraction of ASEAN virtual exchange. How do we promote ASEAN countries within the ASEAN region? Some universities and countries have difficulties to send students within the ASEAN region, especially when there's competition from countries outside of the ASEAN region. issues of intercultural component and competence need to be dealt with as well. And also the facilities and infrastructures of universities. The existence of digital divide is making things quite difficult with regards to promoting virtual exchange. Now, there's so much potential to virtual exchange. We see that there's a lot of opportunities. Some universities, for example, those within the Indonesian region, there's the International Indonesian Student Mobility Award, discovery years that provides government funding that used to take place on physical exchange could be also explored towards the virtual exchanges. There's also a need to retool academics and also repackage virtual exchange for all academics to consider, to think out of the box. So we hope with this research, we're able to get some ideas where we'll be able to map the current situation and definition and framework of virtual exchanges in the ASEAN region. I think back to you, Keiko.
Thank you, Latif. So as Latif has clearly elaborated about the overview and also tapping onto the institutional issues, we are also tapping onto a student's targeted investigation in terms of student experience in this study as well. So I'll focus on that a little bit to mention. In the early 2020, the COVID-19, as you know, the pandemic struck the higher educational institutions globally, and so forcing everybody to go digital in the delivery of education. At the time, many university and their administrators, as well as the instructors and students, found themselves underprepared to adapt this unexpected new normal. As we proceed, though, however, with a digitally enhanced or mediated education mode, we can observe a rise of a digital literacy among the students in the higher educational institutions in ASEAN regions, and that's the key there. And I'm going to refer to UNICEF's 2020 report here for the following slides. And it has stated in that report that failure to leverage digital literacy will affect a person's lifelong learning, pandemic or not. And we believe that this is very true. And that is why it is important to capture the status quo on this point. Digital literacy here refers to the person's ability to use digital platforms for finding, consuming, evaluating, creating, and communicating digital content. And the results report from UNICEF here shows that in many countries, the students in age between 10 to 24 rate their own digital literacy rather good. And there seems to be a slightly more the case for non-LDC than LDC. However, clearly, there seems to be a good rise on the literacy level overall. And same study shows that all countries show that students consider digital literacy and its training opportunity to improve is important for their future. The digital literacy training here can be done through experiences like a virtual exchange or a COIL to enhance authentic application of the skills while engaged in a collaborative learning online. Long before COVID-19 forced colleges and universities to go exclusively online with the educational models, virtual exchanges become popular worldwide, and this trend is coming to ASEAN region as well now. As Latif has mentioned earlier, and as you can also see in this slide, there are various virtual exchange programs made available in the region now. And practices like this liaison to other regions beyond the ASEAN regions and create the global partnerships. In our study, we'd like to learn what kind of online experiences are actually being made available now to students and how to promote virtual exchange-like practices furthermore. Let me add a few slides to convey what I mean a bit further here. With the digital technology being ubiquitously available now, there can be many things other than the virtual exchange in the practice, so it is worth teasing them apart. Let me formulate it in a way to differentiate what is virtual exchange and what is not. So simple MOOCs with no sustained interactions between small groups of students is not virtual exchange. Distance learning courses are not virtual exchange. Creating social media groups, only that is not a virtual exchange, clearly. And unmoderated, unsustained, unstructured programs are not virtual exchange. And most importantly, this is the point, virtual exchange is not to be seen as study abroad light. It should be seen as a separate pedagogy. Within the virtual exchange practice also, there are very different types now. Stevens Initiatives by Aspen Institute in the United States has issued recently on the typology of a virtual exchange. This tells you that there are a wide varieties now. So what so far, based on what I'm familiar within my center, the IIGE, for example, as shown in this slide, just for your reference. These types can cover all different themes and subject areas, such as language learning, cross-cultural learning, etc. And it can also be credit-bearing or not credit-bearing. And of course, virtual exchange creates various interdisciplinary collaborations as well. So through this study, we hope to explore what kinds of virtual exchanges are adopted in the various institutions in the region and how they are appreciated by the students as well. That's it from us, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Keiko and Latif, and it's a really fascinating early stage of the study. So we're looking forward to seeing the further development of this and bringing it to the wider audience in ASEAN to see how we move things forward. In moving things forward, I'd now like to turn to Mr. Zhengwei Kuo, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Accreditation. Headquartered in Singapore, Accreditation is an information technology and services company that supports higher education institutions with the digitalization of academic credentials that are easily verifiable and portable using blockchain technology. Zhengwei leads the team in establishing the company's strategic vision, direction, focusing on business developments and partnerships and sales. Zhengwei, thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Darren. My presentation is going to be slightly different. I'm going to share a lot more of my personal experience over the past 1.5 years as we work with particularly different schools in two countries, the Netherlands as well as Singapore, and then how we overcome some of the challenges in having cross-border verification and recognition of credentials. And then after that, I will share a little bit about what's next for us. And then lastly, thanks Darren and the team for having me here. So a little bit of context. I mean, for those who were here with us last year, I shared quite extensively on how this all started, what was the progress, where we are going, etc. And then I'm very excited to further share about the outcome of the pilot program, and then how the kind of challenges that we face and what we learned from it. So for a little bit of context, this is really a private-public collaboration between the different parties in Netherlands as well as in Singapore. It was led by the Dutch Blockchain Coalition, where they had actually brought a Dutch mission over to Singapore when we still could travel. And then we had a great session with different stakeholders. Some of them you see on the screen here: TU Delft, NUS, Rabobank. From the public sector, we have people like GovTech Singapore as our technology partner, as well as Duo, which is one of the organizations under the Ministry of Education in the Netherlands. So the whole team was filled with a mix of academics, people from the corporate world, people from the education world, and of course people from the technology world. And together we sort of put together a pilot program that ran, because of COVID, it sort of got delayed by a bit, but ran all the way from November 2019 and concluded a month ago. Without further ado, I'm going to share a little bit more about the results that we have. And you see on the screen here, it's actually a copy of TU Delft Certificate of Professional Education. I mask out the name. But these similarly simple looking certificates were actually made verifiable as well as recognized in Singapore. So we chose nicely some Singaporean who was taking his course in Delft. And then when he finished the CPE course, we managed to issue him a verifiable content that is now recognized across all the different schools in Singapore and can be easily used for things like credit transfer, as well as the recognition of the credential itself. So it was quite interesting that when we first started the program, we actually had a few KPIs. Firstly, we must save time in terms of generation of the certificate to recognition of the certificates. For anyone here, if you've been to even short programs across the border, like an exchange program, or took your degree or master's abroad, it's not uncommon for you to take around 4 to 6 weeks before your credits can be sent back to your home country. So that was identified as one of the biggest problems, because especially for graduating students, they could be taking some courses in the host country, and then by the time that their credits are transferred back, they might even see delays in their graduation. So the time saved was quite significant. From 4 to 6 weeks, we managed to shorten it to less than a day. That is all the way from preparation of the certificate to the issuance of the certificate to the transfer of the certificate into the hands of the individual or the learner, and then back to the home country. So the end-to-end took all the way from 6 weeks to a day, which was quite nice. Then the next KPI that we had was actually having less manpower involved. For those people in the audience that are in the academic offices, you should know a simple looking piece of paper like this can go through multiple hands, and especially when it comes to physical paper, you are talking about copies and copies, certified true copy, as you bring from one country to another country, one school to another school. So we managed to clean this up and really build a software solution that allowed Delft to issue this with just one administrator, and the information can then be passed back to a school like NUS. And again, without any manpower involved, they are able to extract the content of the certificate, verify that it came from Delft, and then populate the content into the student management system. So end-to-end, you are talking about manpower save from maybe 4 to 5 different hands to just one administrator. Then, of course, if you were to quantify the time as well as the manpower involved, you are looking at substantial cost saving. But at the end of the day, what was the most important, and I think like what Anthony has shared, is really about proving that cross-border recognition can be possible. And then we just did it in two very simple characteristics. Number one, you must know that this actually came from the host country. And number two, you must be able to extract and verify that nothing in the content has changed. That's about it. If you can settle these two simple problems, the end-to-end cross-border recognition is done. And then you can start, building on other kind of features on top of that, such as very nice things that Europass, as well as some of the initiative in Singapore actually have. So I'm good that the results were fantastic. We had good fun, but really the challenge was quite significant. I'm going to go through most of them quite quickly and then put it into the panel if you're interested in knowing more about each of them. I think the first one was getting the buy-in. When we first started the project, we have at least 3 different universities in Netherlands, 3 different universities in Singapore, and a bunch of ministries on board. But towards the end of it, we are left with TU Delft and NUS. So I think external and internal buy-in has been quite a challenge for us, as it's always been a chicken and egg thing, where do you build a solution first, or do you get people involved in the program first? So it was kind of like a pull and pull, trying to get the right people in place and the right levers, and that has been particularly challenging. But the way that we overcome it, simply put, is be very clear and concise on what we call the minimum viable ecosystem. So regardless of whether you are talking about digital credentials or any other solution that you want to put in place, identify that minimum viable ecosystem. So it could be certain players across the value chain. It could be, I don't know, people across different countries, whatever you think is right for you. But scoping that down to that level then allow you to really push hard for the right buy-ins. And once you get sufficient buy-in, like let's say one school in Singapore and one school in Netherlands, you don't have to waste, the extra effort to get just another school for the sake of it. So I think identifying the minimum viable ecosystem was one key thing that allowed us to clear this issue of getting the buy-in. Technical problems, although there's always a solution for a technical challenge, but having said that, is also balancing with resource as well as timeline. So this one was particularly difficult when we started talking about integrations. So what we did was we decided to have a mix of different solutions put in place. That includes overcoming some of the security challenges by putting in place mechanisms where information don't pass directly from organization to organization. So, for example, a very traditional way to handle credentials verification would be to have a centralized body storing all of the different credentials from the one side and from the other side, and allow people within the same ecosystem to verify against it. So when you do that, you are talking about high counterparty risk, single point of failure. We are talking about a very high barrier of entry towards smaller schools or organizations that want to come to be a part of it. So the way that we, I think, quite elegantly solved this particular technical issue was we focused on learner-owned credentials. So how can we get credentials from one organization, put it into the hands of the individual, and then allow the individual to decide where, who, and what he or she wants to share. So in the case of the TU Delft one, we put the credentials, we don't take it directly from TU Delft, leave it with Accreditation and allow NUS to access, or push it directly from TU Delft to NUS. Because all of this, you start to have a lot of issues in between. What we did was get the credentials, make it verifiable, put it in the hands of the individual that took the course. Then that individual is the one that consents and then passes on the credential to NUS. So that end-to-end then allow us to solve a lot of technical issues. Data privacy was a huge nightmare, I would say. GDPR issues. We had to reconfigure the way that we structure our PKI infrastructure, the way that we generate hashes for our certificates, the way that we look at ownership of the credentials. I can go for a long time on this topic alone. So for GDPR, we actually had to hire actual lawyers, make sure that every part of what we are doing is compliant. And then I would say we didn't approach it the best manner. It was more reactive than proactive. Basically, we allowed the legal team to really poke holes into whatever that we are doing. Then we reacted to each of these different holes and then patch it up and then make sure that all of the kind of angles are being covered. But the good thing is you do it once, you do it right. Subsequently, it gets easier. Or if not, you can just replicate. If not, you just replicate the same model and you will still be compliant. So big issue. It took us more than 3.5 months just to, everything was done. Every single thing was done. Everybody was ready. We can start issuing, certificates and credentials. But this GDPR and data privacy issue took us another 3.5 months just to settle it before we can move ahead. But coming to the exciting part, I think for now, we are really looking at a cross-ASEAN network that we can create. Accreditation is strong in the Southeast Asian and a larger ASEAN region, and we will continue to build on top of that and really hope that we can reach a certain critical mass And beyond that, it's really about collaboration. The Delft and Singapore one was really just a showcase, but we need a much higher level collaboration because we can't approach schools and countries individually. So I'm thinking, in a way where, if Europass and some sort of ASEAN network can connect directly, then we are talking about, leveraging on different network and 1 + 1 = 10. So again, very excited to be here. I will pass it back to Darren as we go into the panel session.
Thank you very much, Zheng Wei. That's excellent. So I would like to get to some questions from the audience, and we have a first question here from Dr. Romien Kosaikanont. She's the Center Director of CMEO RIHEAD. And perhaps it's a question most for Anthony and Zheng Wei, because it does relate to digital credentials. So the question is, if we're looking, well, forgive me, okay. If we're looking at the user ownership basis of Europass and possibly other digital credentials, how does the learner get their credential?
So I think the easiest metaphor to use here is if you think of a credential like money, we've created a very similar set of storage instruments. So just like you can store your money in your own personal wallet, or you can store it in a bank account, and you can store it in any bank account you want and transfer it between bank accounts. That's the type of infrastructure we've been building for Europass for credentials. You can store it in your own individual credential wallet on your device, or if you don't want to be responsible, you can use one of many wallet providers online, and at least for Europass credentials, we require that these wallet providers are interoperable.
Okay, so it's very much ownership based by the student. Perhaps we can now move over to the more learner-centered focus, well, additionally, equally learner-centered. And we had a question also from Dr. Romien to Keiko and Latif. The first question, okay, I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself. If we could just share that question on the screen, please. Great, so this is for Latif. What are the main differences in the definitions of virtual mobility exchanges you've found in the research so far? I'm hoping it's not too early to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Darren, and thank you very much, Dr. Romien, the RIHEAD Director. Very honored to have a question from you. We are actually in the initial stage of our research and hoping for the full research to take off in August and September. We are at the moment compiling literature review and looking through some conceptualizations and definitions being provided by past research. So a research from an Erasmus research under Evolve had actually differentiated between what virtual exchange and virtual mobility is. The virtual exchange is seen to be something much more sustainable, which is very much technologically enabled, and there should be some regular synchronous and asynchronous form of communication and interaction. At the same time, it also should be facilitated, and there should be some integration of a formal or an informal way of communication and constant discussions. And it should also be very, very structured. So for example, a student can attend a course in another university and participate in the classes, doing the assignments, engaging with the students there, and also with the professors from overseas, and that could be a part of it. And with regards to virtual mobility, the study actually looked at it as more of like a form of a distance online education where it involves only one-off meetings or unmoderated kind of situation. Now, from this research, we hope to get some idea over the understanding of the definitions as well, Dr. Romien. We're hoping to see whether universities in ASEAN region do have a differentiations to the definitions, or we hope to see whether they consider virtual mobility to be very, very similar to virtual exchange as well. So I hope to get more results in a couple of months, and we'll write into you with regards to that. Thank you.
We'll certainly be following that closely. We also have a question for Keiko, and it's coming up now. Good. So if we don't see virtual exchange as study abroad light, how do we see it, or how should we see it? And what is the future of virtual exchange post-COVID-19? We're all looking forward to post-COVID-19.
Right, we all are. Thank you very much for the question. So it's been, because of the COVID, it's been, everybody wants to see a solution, right? While the mobility is shut down, everybody wants to see that this COIL and virtual exchange can actually replace what we hope to provide to the students, but it's actually not. So the perspective to be taken is that it's study abroad, and that brings a lot of plus effects, the learning gains for the students, and that's there, and that should not be considered as something the virtual exchange and COIL can equally provide. It's rather, there are different objectives and accomplishments that you can actually obtain through the practice like virtual exchange and COIL. So post-COVID, now the mobility is back. This is our question. How do we actually have the two options or multiple options to actually juggle with? You know, are we just going to go to one of them, or are we deciding a design of a blending a mix of it? And that refers to how to quality assure this educational quality. And then that might be leads to the two other gentlemen talks about the accreditability as well. So those are pretty much the challenges that we face. But one thing very clear is virtual exchange is not going to replace study abroad.
Okay, so there's definitely still a great desire to study abroad, but it's complementary. Okay, we had a question for Zheng Wei on internship accreditation. So in European universities, it's very common and it accrues credits. Would it be something you'd look at in Accredify?
Thanks, Dr. Bob. I think that is something that we are already doing today. So example, in the transcripts that come out of a higher education institute in Singapore, it doesn't just include your grades and your modules. It also has your internship as well as your performance in the internship. So like what Anthony has shared, the way that we approach it is very similar to the Europass model, where it really doesn't matter what you want to put inside. We do have a strong focus on academic credentials, but we are branching out to all sorts of different ones. An example I can give you is that in Singapore, we have an organization called the Institute of Technical Education. So it's a little bit like the vocation training in Europe. So what we did over there is that we are working with them and across 300 over companies that they have to have credentials issued for on-job training. So recognizing skills, recognizing vocational trainings, that I think is something really interesting that we have coming up.
Great. Yeah, certainly. And look, there's so much to unpack here. There's so much to take the discussion forward. I haven't really done our panelists justice by giving them only an hour to discuss this, and really meaty topics. And we're having much more learner-centered discussions now on the digital transformation and the various dimensions of international education. Still, issues of recognition and quality are key, and they will need to be resolved and understood well before this architecture comes in and really comes into its own. We will be, of course, following this discussion further. We will have another policy dialogue later this year, most likely in November, and you can expect to see our panelists at that policy dialogue also, and we can continue the conversation. So I'd like to thank our panelists for their presentations today, and once again, apologies on behalf of Cher for it being so short, but we are really looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've run a little bit over time on the second day. I felt it was valuable, though, certainly to have the questions. We'd like to thank everyone for joining this session on the YouTube link, and thank you also for your questions. For day 3, we have another interesting panel coming up, and if we could just take a look at that. We'll have a keynote speech by the Asia Europe Foundation's Executive Director, His Excellency Ambassador Morikawa Toru. And then our panel discussion is on equity, diversity and inclusion in ASEAN's internationalization. So we hope you'll join us at that session, and we look forward to seeing you then and having your questions. Thank you again. Goodbye from us.